The mechanic was alone in the space station, as usual. The hum of the machines was the only sound he had heard for weeks. But tonight, something was different. A loud, metallic crash echoed through the station, shaking the walls. He grabbed his tools and rushed to the airlock, his heart pounding. Outside, in the cold darkness of space, he saw it, a strange, glowing ship, unlike anything he had ever seen. It was damaged, sparks flying from its hull. Without thinking, he put on his suit and stepped out to investigate. As he approached the ship, a door slid open and a figure fell out. It was a woman, but not human. Her skin shimmered like starlight, and her eyes glowed faintly. She was injured, barely conscious. The mechanic hesitated for a moment, then picked her up and carried her back to the station. Inside, he laid her on a table and began to treat her wounds. She stirred, her eyes opening slowly. She looked at him, her gaze piercing. "You must help me," she whispered, her voice strange and melodic. "They are coming." Before he could ask who she meant, she passed out again. The mechanic stood there, staring at her. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into, but he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away now. The mechanic worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced precision. He had no idea how the alien woman's body worked, but her injuries seemed similar to a human's: broken bones, burns, and deep cuts. He used what he had in the station's medical bay to stabilize her. As he worked, he couldn't help but glance at her ship, still visible through the station's window. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The metal was smooth and reflective, almost like liquid, and the glowing patterns on its surface pulsed faintly, as if alive. Once the woman was stable, he grabbed his tools and headed back outside. The ship was massive, far larger than it had seemed at first glance. Up close, the damage was even more apparent: gaping holes in the hull, wires sparking, and strange fluids leaking out. The mechanic hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should even touch it. But then he remembered the woman's words: "You must help me." He got to work, starting with the most obvious damage. The ship's technology was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The tools he used on human ships barely made a dent, and the materials were so advanced he couldn't even identify them. But the mechanic was resourceful. He had spent his life fixing things others thought were beyond repair. This was just another challenge. Hours passed as he worked, his hands growing numb from the cold. Slowly, he began to understand the ship's systems. The glowing patterns on the hull seemed to respond to his touch, shifting and changing as he repaired them. It was almost as if the ship was alive, guiding him. Back inside the station, the alien woman began to stir. The mechanic rushed to her side, his heart racing. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a mixture of fear and relief. "The ship," she whispered, her voice weak. "Is it safe?" "I'm working on it," the mechanic said. "But I need to know more. Who are you? What happened to you?" The woman hesitated, her glowing eyes scanning his face. "I cannot tell you everything," she said finally. "But know this: my ship carries something important. Something that could change everything. If they find me." She didn't finish the sentence, but the mechanic didn't need her to. He could see the fear in her eyes, and it sent a chill down his spine. "Who's after you?" he asked. Before she could answer, the station's alarms blared. The mechanic rushed to the control panel, his stomach sinking as he saw what was on the radar. 3 ships were approaching, fast. They weren't human. "They're here," the woman said, her voice trembling. "You must finish the repairs. If they capture me, all is lost." The mechanic didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his tools and ran back to the ship, his mind racing. He had no idea what he was up against, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let them take her. As he worked, the alien woman appeared at the airlock, leaning heavily against the door. "There's no time," she said. You must activate the core. You must activate the core. It's the only way. The core? The mechanic asked, confused. She pointed to a glowing panel on the ship's interior. Press it, she said. But be careful. It will respond to your touch. The mechanic hesitated, then reached out and pressed the panel. Instantly, the ship came to life. The glowing patterns on the hull brightened, and a low hum filled the air. The mechanic felt a strange sensation, as if the ship was reading his mind. It's working, the woman said, a hint of hope in her voice. But we're not safe yet. They're here. The mechanic turned to see the 3 alien ships closing in, their weapons glowing ominously. He had no idea how to fight them, but he knew he had to try. Get inside, he said to the woman. I'll handle this. She nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. As she climbed into the ship, the mechanic took a deep breath and prepared for the fight of his life. The mechanic's hands trembled as he gripped the controls of the alien ship. He had never flown anything like it before, but the ship seemed to respond to his thoughts, as if it knew what he wanted to do. The 3 enemy ships were closing in fast, their weapons charging with a menacing glow. Hold on, he shouted to the alien woman, who was strapped into a seat behind him. The ship's interior was sleek and futuristic, with glowing panels and holographic displays. It was overwhelming, but the mechanic didn't have time to think. He had to act. The first blast from the enemy ships narrowly missed them, shaking the ship violently. The mechanic swerved, using the ship's advanced agility to dodge the next attack. He didn't know how to fire the ship's weapons, but he didn't need to. His goal was to escape, not fight. Can you help me with this? He asked the woman, glancing back at her. She looked pale and weak, but she nodded and reached for a nearby panel. Her fingers moved quickly, activating a series of controls. I've engaged the cloaking device, she said, her voice strained. But it won't last long. We need to lose them before they find us again. The mechanic nodded, pushing the ship to its limits. The stars outside blurred as they sped through space, the enemy ships hot on their trail. The mechanic's mind raced as he tried to think of a plan. He couldn't keep running forever. Suddenly, an idea struck him. Is there a way to create a diversion? He asked. The woman hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but it's risky. If we eject the core's energy, it will create a shockwave that could disable their ships. But it will also drain our power. Do it, the mechanic said without hesitation. The woman's hands flew over the controls, and a moment later, the ship shuddered as a burst of energy exploded behind them. The mechanic watched as the enemy ships were thrown off course, their systems temporarily disabled. It worked, he exclaimed, relief flooding through him. It worked, he exclaimed, relief flooding through him. For now, the woman said grimly. But they'll recover soon. We need to find a safe place to hide. The mechanic scanned the area, looking for anything that could help them. In the distance, he spotted a dense asteroid field. It was dangerous, but it might be their only chance. Hold on, he said, steering the ship toward the asteroids. The ship weaved through the rocky debris, the mechanic's hands steady on the controls. The enemy ships were still behind them, but they were struggling to navigate the field. The mechanic used the asteroids to his advantage, dodging and weaving until the enemy ships were out of sight. Finally, they emerged on the other side of the field, the enemy ships nowhere to be seen. The mechanic let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. We did it, he said, turning to the woman. But she wasn't celebrating. Her face was pale, and she was clutching her side. The mechanic's relief turned to concern as he realized she was bleeding. You're hurt, he said, moving to her side. It's nothing, she said weakly. But we're not safe yet. They'll keep looking for us. We need to keep moving. The mechanic nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread in his chest. They had escaped for now, but the danger was far from over. As he set a course for a nearby star system, the woman leaned back in her seat, her eyes closing. "Thank you," she whispered. "You've done more for me than I could ever repay." The mechanic didn't know what to say. He had only done what he thought was right, but he couldn't deny that he was in over his head. Still, he couldn't turn back now. He had made a promise to help her, and he intended to keep it. As the ship sped through the stars, the mechanic couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. But one thing was certain, this was only the beginning. The mechanic guided the ship toward a small, uninhabited planet on the edge of the star system. It was a barren place, with rocky terrain and a thin atmosphere, but it would provide temporary shelter. As they descended, the alien woman grew weaker, her breathing shallow and labored. The mechanic knew he had to act fast. Once they landed, he carried her out of the ship and set her down gently on the ground. He used the supplies from the station's medical kit to tend to her wounds, but it was clear she needed more advanced care than he could provide. "You need to tell me what's going on," he said as he worked. "Who are you? What's so important about that ship?" The woman hesitated, her glowing eyes studying him. She seemed to be weighing her options, deciding how much she could trust him. Finally, she sighed and nodded. "My name is unimportant," she said softly. "But I am a scientist. My people have been at war for generations, fighting over resources, power, and territory. I discovered something, a device that could end the war forever. But not everyone wants peace." The mechanic frowned. "What kind of device?" "A prototype," she explained. "It has the power to unite minds, to create understanding between species. It could end the cycle of violence, but it could also be used as a weapon. That's why they're after me. They want to destroy it, or worse, use it to control others." The mechanic sat back, processing her words. It sounded like something out of a science fiction story, but the evidence was right in front of him. The advanced ship, the enemy pursuers, the woman's injuries, it was all real. "Why come to me?" he asked. "Why not go to your own people?" "I tried," she said, her voice filled with sorrow. "But I was betrayed. There are those among my kind who would rather see the war continue than risk peace. I had no one else to turn to." The mechanic felt a pang of sympathy. He had always been a solitary person, content to work alone in the quiet of the space station. But now, he was part of something much bigger than himself. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. The woman reached out and placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, almost comforting. "Help me deliver the device to a neutral faction. They will know what to do with it. But we must hurry. The longer we wait, the greater the risk." The mechanic nodded. He didn't fully understand the stakes, but he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away. Not now. As they prepared to leave the planet, the mechanic couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He scanned the horizon, but there was nothing but rocks and dust. Still, the sense of unease lingered. "We need to move," he said, helping the woman back into the ship. Once they were inside, the mechanic activated the ship's systems. The glowing panels lit up, and the hum of the engines filled the air. He set a course for the coordinates the woman had given him, a distant star system where the neutral faction was said to be located. As they lifted off, the woman leaned back in her seat, her eyes closing. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have given me hope." The mechanic didn't respond. He was too focused on the task at hand. But deep down, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The journey was long, and the mechanic spent most of it checking the ship's systems and keeping an eye on the woman's condition. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her strength fading with each passing hour. Finally, they reached the edge of the star system. The mechanic could see the neutral faction's outpost in the distance, a massive space station surrounded by ships from various alien species. "We're almost there," he said, turning to the woman. But she didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. The mechanic's heart sank as he realized she might not make it. "Hold on," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "Just a little longer." As they approached the outpost, the mechanic sent a distress signal, hoping someone would respond. Moments later, a voice crackled over the comms. "Identify yourself," it said. The mechanic hesitated, then spoke. "I'm a human mechanic. I have someone who needs help, and something you need to see." There was a pause, then the voice replied, "Prepare to dock." The mechanic guided the ship toward the outpost, his hands steady on the controls. He didn't know what awaited them, but he knew one thing: they were running out of time. The mechanic guided the ship into the docking bay of the massive space station, his hands gripping the controls tightly. The alien woman was barely conscious now, her breathing shallow and uneven. He could feel the weight of her mission pressing down on him, but there was no turning back. As the ship settled into place, a group of figures approached. They were a mix of species, their appearances as varied as their expressions, some curious, others wary. At the front was a tall, imposing figure with silver skin and glowing blue eyes. "I am Commander Valen," the figure said, their voice deep and resonant. "You sent a distress signal. Explain yourself." The mechanic stepped out of the ship, helping the alien woman to her feet. She leaned heavily on him, her strength nearly gone. "She's a scientist," he said quickly. "She has something important, a device that could end the war. But she's injured, and we're being pursued." Commander Valen's eyes narrowed as they studied the woman. "We've heard rumors of such a device," they said. "But why bring it here?" "Because you're neutral," the mechanic replied. "She said you would know what to do with it." The commander hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Bring her inside. We'll see what we can do." The mechanic helped the woman into the station, where a medical team was waiting. They took her from him, placing her on a stretcher and rushing her away. The mechanic watched them go, a knot of worry tightening in his chest. "Come with me," Commander Valen said, gesturing for the mechanic to follow. They led him to a large, dimly lit room filled with holographic displays and alien technology. The mechanic felt out of place, but he forced himself to focus. "Tell me everything," the commander said. The mechanic recounted the events of the past few days, how he had found the woman, repaired her ship, and escaped the enemy pursuers. He left out no detail, hoping it would help them understand the urgency of the situation. When he finished, the commander nodded slowly. "You've done well to get this far," they said. "But there's something you should know." The mechanic frowned. "What is it?" "The device your friend carries is more dangerous than you realize," the commander explained. "It has the power to unite minds, yes, but it can also be used to control them. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could plunge the galaxy into chaos." The mechanic's heart sank. "But she said it could bring peace." "It can," the commander said. "But only if used correctly. And not everyone wants peace." Before the mechanic could respond, an alarm blared through the station. The holographic displays lit up with warnings, and the commander's expression turned grim. "They've found us," they said. The mechanic's stomach churned as he realized what was happening. The enemy ships had tracked them to the outpost. "What do we do?" he asked. The commander turned to him, their glowing eyes intense. "You must protect the device at all costs. If they take it, all is lost." The mechanic nodded, his mind racing. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to give up now. As the station prepared for battle, the mechanic made his way back to the medical bay. The alien woman was awake, her eyes filled with fear. "They're here," she whispered. I know, the mechanic said. But we're not going to let them win. She reached out and grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. There's something I need to tell you, she said. Something I didn't want to say before. The mechanic frowned. What is it? The device. It's not just a tool for peace, she admitted. It's also a weapon. I didn't want to tell you because I was afraid you wouldn't help me if you knew. The mechanic's heart sank. He felt a flash of anger, but it was quickly replaced by understanding. She had been desperate, and he couldn't blame her for that. It doesn't matter, he said firmly. We're in this together now. We'll figure it out. The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. As the station shook from the impact of enemy fire, the mechanic knew they were running out of time. He helped the woman to her feet, supporting her as they made their way to the ship. We need to get out of here, he said. But as they reached the docking bay, they were met by a group of armed figures. They weren't the enemy, they were members of the neutral faction. Hand over the device, one of them said, their weapon trained on the mechanic. The mechanic's heart raced as he realized what was happening. The neutral faction wasn't as neutral as they claimed. You're betraying us? He asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The device is too powerful to be left in the hands of a human and a rogue scientist, the figure replied. Hand it over, or we'll take it by force. The mechanic glanced at the woman, who nodded weakly. They had no choice. Fine, he said, stepping forward. But you'll have to go through me first. The mechanic stood his ground, shielding the alien woman as the armed figures closed in. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but there were too many of them. The neutral faction had turned against them, and now they were trapped. This is your last chance, the lead figure said, their weapon aimed at the mechanic's chest. Hand over the device, and we'll let you live. The mechanic clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He didn't trust them, but he also knew they couldn't fight their way out. He glanced at the woman, who was leaning heavily against the wall, her strength nearly gone. Do it, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's the only way. The mechanic hesitated, then nodded. He reached into the ship and pulled out the device, a small, glowing orb that pulsed with energy. The armed figure's eyes widened as they saw it, their greed evident. Here, the mechanic said, holding it out. Take it. The lead figure stepped forward, their hand outstretched. But as they reached for the device, the alien woman suddenly lunged forward, grabbing it and pressing a hidden button on its surface. No, she shouted, her voice filled with determination. The device began to glow brighter, its energy surging. The armed figures stumbled back, their weapons lowering as they realized what was happening. What have you done? The lead figure demanded, their voice filled with panic. The woman turned to the mechanic, her eyes filled with sorrow. I'm sorry, she said. But this is the only way. Before the mechanic could respond, she shoved the device into his hands and pushed him toward the ship. Go, she shouted. Get out of here. The mechanic hesitated, his heart breaking as he realized what she was about to do. No, I can't leave you. You must, she said, her voice firm. The device is safe with you. Protect it at all costs. The armed figures recovered from their shock and raised their weapons, but the woman stepped in front of them, blocking their path. Run, she screamed. The mechanic's eyes filled with tears as he climbed into the ship, the device clutched tightly in his hands. He activated the engines, the ship roaring to life. As he lifted off, he saw the woman standing tall. Her glowing eyes filled with defiance. The last thing he saw before the ship shot out of the docking bay was the woman collapsing to the ground, her body surrounded by the armed figures. The mechanic's hands trembled as he steered the ship away from the station, his heart heavy with grief. He didn't know if the woman was alive or dead, but he knew one thing, she had sacrificed herself to save him and the device. As the ship sped through space, the mechanic set a course for a remote sector of the galaxy, far from the war and the factions fighting over the device. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but he knew he had to honor the woman's sacrifice. The device pulsed in his hands, its energy warm and comforting. It was a symbol of hope, but also a reminder of the cost of that hope. The mechanic vowed to protect it, no matter what. The mechanic flew the ship through the vast emptiness of space, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Grief, anger, and determination battled within him as he clutched the glowing device. The alien woman's sacrifice weighed heavily on his heart, but he knew he couldn't let her down. He had to finish what she had started. The device pulsed softly in his hands, its energy warm and steady. It was a strange thing, both beautiful and terrifying. He didn't fully understand its power, but he knew it was the key to something greater, something that could change the galaxy forever. As he approached a remote asteroid belt, the mechanic decided it was time to stop and regroup. He needed a plan, and he couldn't think clearly while flying aimlessly through space. He found a small, stable asteroid with a flat surface and landed the ship, its engines humming softly as they powered down. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the device. The alien woman's words echoed in his mind, "Protect it at all costs." But how? He was just a mechanic, not a hero. He didn't know how to fight a war or broker peace. All he knew was how to fix things. Maybe that's enough, he muttered to himself. He spent the next few hours examining the device, using his tools to study its intricate design. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a perfect blend of technology and energy. As he worked, he began to understand its purpose. The device wasn't just a tool for peace, it was a bridge, a way to connect minds and foster understanding. But it could also be a weapon, capable of forcing its will on others. The mechanic realized why the woman had been so desperate to protect it. In the wrong hands, it could be used to control entire civilizations. But in the right hands, it could bring an end to the war and unite the galaxy. As he worked, the ship's sensors suddenly blared an alert. The mechanic's heart skipped a beat as he saw what was on the radar, a fleet of ships approaching, their signatures unmistakable. It was the enemy. They had found him. "How?" he whispered, his hands trembling. But there was no time to wonder. He had to act fast. The mechanic grabbed the device and activated the ship's systems, his mind racing. He couldn't outrun them, and he couldn't fight them. But maybe, just maybe, he could use the device to stop them. As the enemy ships closed in, the mechanic made a decision. He would use the device to send a message of peace. If it worked, it might reach the minds of those aboard the enemy ships and make them understand. If it didn't, well, he didn't want to think about that. He placed the device on the ship's control panel and connected it to the communication system. The device began to glow brighter, its energy surging as it prepared to transmit. The mechanic took a deep breath and activated the device. A wave of energy burst from the ship, rippling through space like a shockwave. The mechanic felt it in his mind, a strange, overwhelming sensation of connection and understanding. For a moment, he saw flashes of memories and emotions that weren't his own, visions of war, loss, and hope. The enemy ships stopped in their tracks, their weapons lowering. The mechanic watched in awe as the energy wave reached them, their movements slowing as if they were caught in a trance. "It's working," he whispered, his voice filled with hope. But then, something went wrong. The device began to overheat, its glow turning from a soft blue to a harsh red. The mechanic's heart raced as he realized what was happening. The device was too powerful. It was going to destroy itself, and possibly the ship along with it. He tried to shut it down, but it was too late. The device was beyond his control. "No!" he shouted, his hands frantically working the controls. The ship shook violently as the device's energy surged out of control. The mechanic braced himself, knowing there was nothing he could do. And then, everything went white. When the mechanic opened his eyes, he was surrounded by silence. The ship's systems were offline, the control panels dark and lifeless. For a moment, he thought he was dead. But then he felt the ache in his body and the faint hum of the ship's emergency power. He was alive. He sat up slowly, his head spinning. The device was still on the control panel, but it was no longer glowing. Its surface was cracked and blackened, as if it had burned out from within. The mechanic reached out to touch it, but it crumbled to dust at his fingertips. "What happened?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. He stumbled to the ship's window and looked out. The enemy ships were still there, but they were no longer moving. Their lights were dim, their weapons silent. It was as if they had been frozen in place. The mechanic's heart raced as he realized what had happened. The device had worked, it had reached the minds of those aboard the enemy ships and stopped them. But at what cost? He activated the ship's communication system, hoping to get a signal. To his surprise, a voice crackled through almost immediately. "This is Commander Valen of the neutral faction," the voice said. "Identify yourself." The mechanic hesitated, then replied, "It's me." The mechanic. I think I stopped them." There was a pause, then the commander's voice returned, filled with awe. "You did more than that. The enemy fleet has been disabled. Their commanders are confused. They're talking about peace." The mechanic sank into his seat, relief flooding through him. It had worked. The device had done its job. "What about the device?" the commander asked. "It's gone," the mechanic said, his voice heavy with regret. "It burned out." There was another pause, then the commander said, "You've done something incredible. Something no one else could have done. You've given us a chance to end this war." The mechanic didn't know what to say. He had only done what he thought was right, but it had cost him so much. The alien woman, the device, his own sense of safety, it was all gone. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," the commander said, "we rebuild. And we honor your sacrifice." The mechanic nodded, though no one could see him. He felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that his actions had made a difference. But there was still one thing he needed to do. "I want to go home," he said. The mechanic's journey back to Earth was a quiet one. The ship, though damaged, carried him steadily through the stars. He spent most of the time reflecting on everything that had happened, the alien woman, the device, the sacrifices made, and the lives changed. It felt like a lifetime had passed since he had first heard that strange noise outside his space station. When he finally entered Earth's atmosphere, the sight of his home planet filled him with a mix of emotions. It was familiar, yet everything felt different now. He had seen too much, experienced too much, to go back to the life he had once known. He landed the ship in a remote area, far from any cities or towns. As he stepped out onto the grassy field, he took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air. It was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment of space. For a while, he just stood there, staring at the sky. He thought about the alien woman and her bravery. She had given everything for a cause she believed in, and her sacrifice had changed the course of the galaxy. He wondered if she would ever be remembered, if anyone would know her name. The mechanic knew he couldn't tell anyone what had happened. No one would believe him, and even if they did, it would only complicate things. The device was gone, its purpose fulfilled. The war was over, and that was all that mattered. As he walked away from the ship, he felt a sense of closure. He had done what he could, and now it was time to move on. But he also knew that he would never forget. The lessons he had learned, about courage, sacrifice, and the power of small actions to change the universe, would stay with him forever. Years passed, and the mechanic returned to his old life. He fixed ships and machines, just as he had before. But he was different now. He carried a quiet strength, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. One day, as he was working on a broken engine, a young apprentice asked him, "Why do you do this? Why do you spend your life fixing things?" The mechanic paused, then smiled. "Because sometimes," he said, "the smallest things can make the biggest difference. You never know when a single act of kindness, or a single repair, can change someone's life, or even the world." The apprentice nodded, though they didn't fully understand. But the mechanic knew that one day, they would. As he looked up at the sky that night, he thought about the alien woman and the device. He thought about the war that had ended and the peace that had followed. And he realized that, in the end, it wasn't about grand gestures or powerful tools. It was about people, ordinary people who chose to do the right thing, even when it was hard. The mechanic smiled to himself, knowing that he had played a small part in something much bigger than himself. And that was enough.